Hello guys, and welcome back to Sleepy Battle Stories. Tonight, we climb a hill that was never meant to be famous, a piece of high ground overlooking Boston, held by tired hands and quiet courage. This is the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17, 1775. A battle remembered not for who won the field, but for who proved they would not bend. Envision the night before, shovels scraping soil under lantern glow, colonial militiamen building fortifications in near silence, whispering orders instead of shouting them. Across the harbour, British ships swaying with the tide, unaware that the hill had already been claimed by defiance. Then came the morning, scarlet ranks advancing uphill in disciplined lines, the defenders waiting, breath tight, fingers trembling on triggers, until the order finally drifted through the smoke. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. No wild charge, no reckless roar. Just a measured, iron-nerved patience that turned fear into legend. The British took the hill in the end, yes, but they paid for every inch of ground. And the world watched, realizing something seismic. The colonies could fight, and they would keep fighting. So if you love stories where valor outweighs victory, where history is written in musket smoke and raw resolve, leave a like and subscribe, not out of routine, but because these are the stories you return for. And before the battle begins, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Whether near or far, you're part of this unfolding march through time. Now, lean back, let the room grow distant, and let's drift into the battle where a revolution learned its own strength. The air over Boston in the late spring of 1775 hung thick with the peculiar tension of a stifled scream. It was a port town caught in a grotesque paralysis, its normal rhythms of commerce and community drowned out by the grim symphony of an occupation. For months, following the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord in April, the town had become a fortified island of British authority, a fist clenched against the rising tide of colonial rebellion. Some 10,000 regulars of His Majesty's army, the finest infantry in the world, or so they were told and believed, were penned within the peninsula, commanded by General Thomas Gage. Across the shimmering expanse of the Charles River, and ringing the landward approaches, a loose, evolving cordon of perhaps 15,000 American militia watched and waited. They were men of the Massachusetts Bay, of Connecticut, of New Hampshire and Rhode Island, a citizen army born from committees of safety and the fervent, often chaotic democracy of the town meeting. Their commander, General Artemus Ward, was a man of the old school, plagued by ill health and profound caution, presiding over a force that was less an army and more a palpable expression of collective will, fractious, undersupplied, but stubbornly present. The social order that had long governed Massachusetts Bay had not so much been overturned as violently stretched, its filaments strained to the point of transparency. The elegant hierarchies of royal governor, council, and appointed magistrates now existed only within the narrow confines of Boston, shadow governments run by men in powdered wigs sipping tea while staring at rebel batteries from their windows. Beyond the British lines, that old order had shattered. In its place was a new, raw and untested authority derived from the people themselves, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, still groping toward a unified policy, and the Provincial Congress in Watertown, acting with desperate revolutionary energy. Loyalties, once clear as title deeds, were now treacherous territories of the heart. Families were divided. A man's politics could be read in the set of his jaw or the absence of his name from the tavern roster. The gentlefolk who had once led by right of birth and connection now found their influence contingent upon their stance toward the crown. It was a world turned upside down, where a farmer with a firelock could debate strategy with a Harvard-educated colonel, and where the very concept of legitimacy was the prize for which the impending struggle would be waged. Within the rebel camps, a rough new social contract was being written daily, It was an order based on a volatile mixture of deference to experience and respect for elected authority. Officers were, by and large, chosen by the men they led or appointed by civilian committees. A colonel's rank might rest as much on his standing in his home county as on any knowledge of military science. The men themselves were not the dregs of society, but its backbone: yeoman farmers, artisans, merchants, and sons of merchants. They were men accustomed to self-reliance, to debating matters in open forum, and to questioning authority that seemed arbitrary or unearned. This individualistic spirit was both the great strength and the profound weakness of the army besieging Boston. It meant they fought for a cause they understood and cherished, their very homes and liberties. It also meant they were prone to debate orders, to come and go with the harvest, and to view their enlistments as conditional agreements rather than sacred oaths. They were an army of citizens first, soldiers second, a reality that would weigh heavily on the minds of those who sought to command them in the test that was coming. In Boston, a different, but equally potent social dislocation was at work. The British Army was a microcosm of 18th century European society, its ranks filled with professionals, many of them poor Scots and Irish, led by an officer corps drawn from the aristocracy and gentry. For these officers, service was a career, a means of advancement, and a sacred duty to king and country. They moved in a world of strict protocol, where honour was quantified in precedence, and where a glance could be as deadly as a musket ball. General Gage, a decent and moderate man, was ill-suited for the revolutionary maelstrom in which he found himself. He was a governor trying to administer a rebellion, a conciliator whose time for conciliation had passed. His officers, many of them younger, brasher, and thirsting for distinction, viewed the colonial rabble with a mixture of contempt and professional curiosity. They chafed under Gage's restraint, seeing in the American lines not a principled opposition, but an insolent challenge to be swiftly and brutally corrected. The tension between Gage's desire for a political solution and his subordinates' hunger for a military one was a fault line running through the British command, a hidden pressure that would seek release at the first opportunity. And so the stage was set, not for a grand decisive battle as European wars understood it, but for something more psychologically complex, a violent parley. The two forces, embodying two incompatible visions of order and authority, glared at one another across the narrow waters. The Americans held the land, the British held the town. Between them lay geography that would become destiny, a trio of hills on the Charlestown Peninsula, north of Boston. Dorchester Heights to the south commanded the city and its harbour, but on this June night, the gaze of history and of a few determined men turned toward Charlestown, Breed's Hill, Bunker Hill, Moulton's Hill. They were pasture land, dotted with hay and crisscrossed by fences and lanes, sloping gently down to the river and the wharves of a quiet village. In the grand tactics of empire they were minor features, but in the taut, claustrophobic drama of the siege they were the keys to the kingdom, the high ground from which cannon could threaten the British fleet in the harbour and the very heart of the occupation in Boston. They were for the moment unoccupied, a no-man's land of grass and dew. This silence could not last. In the nature of sieges, in the logic of escalation, and in the hearts of men yearning to shape events rather than be shaped by them, the empty hills were an invitation, a provocation, and a trap waiting to be sprung. The decision to act when it finally came was born from a compound of fear, intelligence, and defensive necessity. Within the American Council of War, a body more deliberative than decisive, a sense of grim inevitability had taken hold. Reliable intelligence, gathered from the network of sailors, merchants, and sympathetic souls still moving in and out of Boston, suggested General Gage was on the verge of a decisive move. The word was that the British intended to break the siege by seizing the unoccupied heights on the Charlestown Peninsula, specifically the dominant rise of Bunker Hill. From such a vantage, their artillery could rake the American lines at Cambridge and Roxbury, making the rebel positions untenable and potentially forcing a disastrous retreat or a pitched battle on open ground. For General Ward and his advisers, the strategic calculus was brutal and clear. To wait was to cede the initiative and possibly lose the army. They must act first. The orders, issued on the afternoon of June 16, 1775, were a masterpiece of caution and monumental risk. A detachment of about 1,200 men was to march under cover of darkness and fortify Bunker Hill. The man entrusted with this fragile enterprise was Colonel William Prescott, a 49-year-old farmer from Pepperell, Massachusetts. Prescott was of the very stock that formed the backbone of the rebellion, substantial, respected, and unwavering. He had seen service in the French and Indian War, experience that granted him a gravity absent in some of his more politically appointed peers. His face, stern and weathered under a broad-brimmed hat, commanded respect, and his character was one of granite resolve. Yet his ambition was not for personal glory, but for the success of the cause, a distinction that would impose upon him a terrible burden of responsibility. Alongside him was a figure of more volatile temperament, Colonel Richard Gridley, the Army's chief engineer, an old artilleryman whose knowledge was vital but whose energies were perhaps not what they once were. And there was also a presence less official but no less significant, Dr. Joseph Warren, President of the Provincial Congress, a man who had forsaken the safety of his role to shoulder a musket as a private soldier. Warren's decision to join the expedition was a potent symbol, a fusion of political and martial commitment that would resonate through the ranks. His presence spoke of the gravity of the hour. This was no mere raid, but an act defining the very nature of the resistance. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that fateful Friday, the selected regiments gathered on the common at Cambridge. There was little of the pomp of European armies. These were men in homespun and leather, their weapons a heterogeneous collection of fowling pieces, ancient muskets and prized rifles. They carried packs, entrenching tools, and a day's worth of salt beef and hard bread. The mood was solemn, focused. Prescott addressed them, his words simple and direct. They had a duty to perform, a hard night's work. Silence and obedience were their watchwords. As dusk deepened into night, the column, a long dark serpent, began its quiet march eastward, across the neck of land that connected the Charlestown Peninsula to the mainland. The only sounds were the muffled tread of many feet, the occasional clink of a tool, and the whisper of the night breeze through the grasses. They moved through a landscape of profound silence, broken only by the distant, familiar challenge of a British sentry from a warship in the Mystic River. The moon, in its first quarter, provided a faint, ghostly light, enough to see the path but not enough to betray their movement to the watchful eyes aboard HMS Lively or Somerset. Upon reaching the summit of Bunker Hill, a debate ensued, a moment of fateful improvisation that would alter everything. Colonel Gridley, perhaps with Prescott's concurrence, made a critical decision. Bunker Hill, while higher and farther back, did not command the same direct line of fire into Boston as the lower, closer Breed's Hill. The original orders were clear, but on the ground in the dark, facing the immediate tactical reality, the officers on the spot chose to reinterpret them. It was a decision born of aggressive defence, a desire to pose the most direct threat possible to the enemy. But it was also a perilous one. Breed's Hill was more exposed, its flanks descending to the shoreline, making the potential position more susceptible to flanking manoeuvres and naval gunfire. Nevertheless, the decision was made. The men, already weary from the march and the weight of their tools, were redirected down the slope to the lower rise. They began to dig, their shovels and picks biting, into the soft, loamy soil of the pasture. The redoubt they marked out was a square about 40 yards on a side with an arrow-shaped bastion pointing toward Boston. It was not the grand fortress of legend, but a simple earthwork, its walls perhaps 6 feet high, surrounded by a ditch. The night was cool, but the men soon worked up a sweat. their labours a steady, rhythmic scraping in the dark. As they dug, the world around them slept. In Boston, British officers dined and gossiped, unaware that the geographic imperative they had discussed was being seized from them. On the decks of the men of war anchored in the Charles River, lookouts peered into the gloom, hearing perhaps a suspicious murmur but seeing nothing definite. The Americans worked with a desperate urgency, knowing that dawn would unveil their handiwork. The silence was their ally, but it was a thinning veil. Around 4 a.m., as the first pale hint of light began to bleed into the eastern sky over the harbour, the veil tore. A watchful eye aboard the 20-gun HMS Lively, commanded by Captain Thomas Bishop, discerned the fresh, raw earth of the rebel fortification taking shape on Breed's Hill. Without waiting for orders from the Admiral, Bishop, acting on his own initiative, did what any aggressive sea officer would do. He ran out his guns and opened fire. The roar of the first broadside shattered the morning calm, the iron shot whistling over the water and thudding into the hillside or crashing through the rooftops of Charlestown below. The Battle of Bunker Hill, though no troops were yet engaged, had begun with the thunder of naval cannon. In the redoubt, men ducked instinctively, but Prescott, striding along the parapet in his characteristic calico coat, urged them on. "The redcoats will never reach us," he is said to have declared, "if we hold our fire and aim true." The digging continued, now to the dreadful accompaniment of sporadic gunfire, as the new day revealed to astonish Boston the audacious transformation of the pastoral peninsula into an armed camp. The thunder of HMS Lively's guns was the alarm bell heard across the width of Boston Harbour. In the grey light of dawn, the town stirred from its slumber to a scene of shocking transformation. Where there had been empty green hills the previous evening, there now stood a defiant scar of fresh earth, a square redoubt from which the rebels could be seen moving like ants. Along the crest of Breed's Hill, a line of dirt was being scratched into existence, a breastwork extending north from the redoubt toward the Mystic River. The strategic map had been redrawn in a single night, and the implications were immediate and profound. For General Gage, gazing from the window of his headquarters, this was the crisis he had dreaded and his subordinates had anticipated. The rebels had stolen a march. They had fortified a position that, if armed with artillery, could make the inner harbour a dangerous place for His Majesty's ships and rain destruction upon the town itself. Political solutions receded before the stark military reality. The position must be taken, and taken quickly. A council of war was convened at the Province House. Around Gage were the men whose ambitions and frustrations would now drive events: Major Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, recently arrived, was all for bold action, viewing the colonial forces with the theoretical disdain of a career officer for a militia. Henry Clinton, the most intellectually gifted of the three, was already peering at the problem with a tactical squint, noting the vulnerabilities of the American left flank. But it was William Howe who would take command of the operation. A veteran of the French and Indian War, where he had led the legendary light infantry at the scaling of the Heights of Abraham, Howe was a soldier's soldier, brave to a fault and popular with his men. He viewed the coming action with a professional's confidence. The rebels were dug in, yes, but they were militia. A direct, disciplined assault by regular troops would dislodge them. The plan was simple, even elegant in its bluntness. A landing of troops on the southeastern tip of the Charlestown Peninsula, a formation into lines, and a frontal advance up the slope to carry the works by bayonet. Artillery would soften the position, and the fleet would provide covering fire. There was little discussion of subtlety or wide flanking manoeuvres. The reputation of the British Army, it was believed, would carry the day. Across the water in the American redoubt, the morning passed in a strange, suspended anxiety. The naval bombardment had been more terrifying in its sound than effective in its execution. The ship's guns, firing from a rolling platform at a steep upward angle, found it difficult to depress their barrels enough to hit the low earthworks. Most shot flew harmlessly overhead or buried itself in the forward slope. But the message was clear. The storm was gathering. Prescott, understanding the precariousness of his advanced post, sent repeated, increasingly urgent requests to Cambridge for reinforcements and, crucially, for fresh water and food. The men had laboured all night without sleep, their canteens were empty, and the June sun was climbing in a clear sky, promising a day of blistering heat. The response from headquarters was agonizingly slow, mired in the cautious, committee-bound nature of the American command. General Ward, fearing a feint and a main attack on his lines at Cambridge or Roxbury, hesitated to commit his reserves. A trickle of men arrived, including the valuable addition of Captain Thomas Knowlton and his Connecticut regiment, who began to extend the breastwork farther to the left. But the needed sustenance and substantial reinforcements did not materialize. This failure of logistics and command revealed a hidden tension within the American cause, the conflict between local authority and central direction, and the inherent suspicion of a standing army. The men on Breed's Hill were from Massachusetts, primarily Prescott's own regiment and others from Essex County. The reinforcements that did come, like Knowlton's men, were from other colonies, acting under their own officers and their own sense of urgency. Coordination was ad hoc, reliant on the personal force of men like Prescott. Furthermore, the very act of entrusting this desperate mission to a detachment had created a psychological chasm between the men on the hill and the main army. They were the sacrifice on the altar of strategy, a fact that began to dawn on some as the morning wore on and the British preparations became visible. A slow, corrosive drip of desertion began. Exhausted, thirsty, and seeing the might arraying against them, individuals and small groups slipped away, back across Charlestown Neck to the relative safety of the mainland. Prescott did not execute the deserters, as he might have in a European army. He lacked both the legal authority and the political capital. He could only stand as an example, pacing the parapet in his uniform coat, a statue of resolve, hoping his visible courage would staunch the flow. By midday, the spectacle unfolding in the harbour was one of awesome, terrible beauty. The water was alive with movement. Longboats, barges and cutters, a forest of oars rising and falling in unison, shuttled back and forth from the transports and warships to the landing point at Moulton's Point. They carried the flower of the British Army in America, the grenadiers, the tall, powerful shock troops in their towering mitre caps, the light infantry, agile and fast, and the solid core of line infantry from regiments with storied names, the 5th, the 38th, the 43rd, the 52nd. They wore their full field packs, weighing nearly 60 pounds, and their scarlet coats, splendid but brutally unsuitable for the heat and the work ahead. The sun glittered on bayonets and brass buttons, and the air carried the sound of boatswains' whistles, the creak of oarlocks, and the low, ordered murmur of officers. It was a pageant of imperial power, a display meant to overawe. From the redoubt, the Americans watched in silence. There was no panic, only a deepening, sombre recognition. The tools were put down, the shovels were exchanged for muskets. Men took their places along the earth wall, checking their priming, fixing their bayonets if they had them, and placing what water and ammunition they had within easy reach. They were farmers and mechanics, about to receive a professional army's full, furious attention. The quiet on the hill was no longer that of secrecy, but of a profound and focused waiting. The British landing, executed with flawless professionalism, began shortly after 1 o'clock. The first waves of light infantry and grenadiers leaped ashore onto the narrow beach and rocky outcrops of Moulton's Point, forming up with crisp efficiency on the high ground beyond. There was no opposition at the water's edge. The Americans had no artillery position to contest the landing, a failure that granted Howe's force a secure foothold. As the boats returned for the second and third waves, the peninsula became a stage for the assembling of a killing machine. Regiments formed into lines, their colours unfurled, their officers on horseback moving before them. General Howe, resplendent in his uniform, surveyed the scene from the point. His plan remained straightforward, but the terrain presented unforeseen complications. The slope up to the American works was not a clean, open field. It was divided by fences, rail fences, stone walls and hedgerows that would break the perfect alignment of his advancing ranks. Furthermore, the breadth of the American position, now extended by Knowlton's men along a fence line that ran from the end of the breastwork down to the Mystic River beach, was wider than he had initially appreciated. Howe made his dispositions. The main assault would be in two powerful parallel columns. The right wing, under his personal command, would attack the redoubt and the breastwork head-on. The left wing, under Brigadier General Robert Pigot, would press against the American left, threatening the redoubt from that side and pinning down the forces there. But a critical adjustment was made. Recognizing the threat posed by the extended American line along the rail fence, Howe detached the bulk of his light infantry and the elite grenadier companies from several regiments. This force, a formidable body of his best troops, was given a separate, decisive mission: to march along the narrow beach of the Mystic River, outflank the American left utterly, and roll up the rebel line from the end. It was a classic tactical masterstroke, exploiting the discipline and shock power of specialized troops against what was presumed to be the militia's weakest point. With the main attacks fixing the rebels in place, the flanking column would be the hammer blow that shattered them. The plan was set. The troops were given a late dinner, a chance to rest in the heat and their final orders. The attack would commence in the early afternoon. On the American side, the final preparations were a study in desperate improvisation. The line had stabilized into three distinct segments. The redoubt, packed with Prescott's Massachusetts men and a few others, was the strong point. Extending north from it was the hastily dug breastwork, manned by a mix of regiments. And angling away from the end of the breastwork down to the Mystic River was the rail fence, an existing farmer's barrier reinforced with straw and hay bales, behind which stood Knowlton's Connecticut men and Stark's newly arrived New Hampshire regiment. Colonel John Stark, a taciturn and fiercely independent frontiersman from New Hampshire, had arrived with his men only that afternoon, marching them onto the field with a cool defiance that steadied every heart that saw him. He immediately saw the critical weakness of the left flank. The rail fence ended at the beach, a strip of sand and stone some 30 yards wide at low tide. It was the open door through which Howe's flanking column intended to march. Stark acted with decisive authority. He ordered his men to drag stones and boulders from the nearby beach to build a crude, low wall extending from the end of the fence right down to the water's edge. Behind this wall he placed his best marksmen 3 ranks deep. It was a simple, brilliant answer to the British manoeuvre, born of practical frontier fighting sense rather than military manual. The psychological strain in these final moments was immense and varied. For the British regular there was the confidence of tradition and training, tempered by the physical discomfort of wool coats under a blazing sun and the unspoken knowledge that marching uphill against an entrenched enemy was never a simple affair. For the junior officers it was a chance for glory, a step on the ladder of promotion. For General Howe it was the execution of a professional task, a heavy responsibility but one he was born and bred to undertake. On the American side the emotions were more elemental. There was fear certainly. The gut-churning sight of thousands of scarlet coats forming lines of battle is not easily dismissed. But it was layered with a fierce, almost possessive determination. They were not fighting for a king in a distant land, but for the ground behind them, for their homes, for the very idea of self-rule that had been articulated in pamphlets and town meetings. They were also fighting for the respect of the world and of the enemy before them. Prescott's continued visible calm was an anchor. Stark's gruff competence was a bulwark. And the silent shared understanding passed from man to man. Wait until you see the whites of their eyes. Aim for the officers. Make every shot count. At approximately 3 in the afternoon the order was given. The British lines began to move. It was a breathtaking, terrifying spectacle. Thousands of men moving as one, their bayonets a gleaming, bristling forest, their steps marked by the relentless beat of drums. The drummers, boys really, tapped out the pace, the slow, deliberate march that would quicken to the charge. The sun glinted off brass and steel, colours fluttered. On the left, Pigot's wing advanced against the redoubt and the village of Charlestown, which had begun to smoulder from incendiary shells fired from Copp's Hill Battery in Boston. On the right, Howe's main body marched straight up the slope toward the breastwork, and unseen by most of the Americans, the special flanking column of light infantry and grenadiers, in close column of companies, began its rapid march along the hard sand of the Mystic River beach, their goal the unprotected end of the rebel line. The noise was a cacophony: drums, the tramp of feet, the distant roar of cannon from the ships and batteries, the crackle of burning Charlestown. But in the American works, a new silence descended, more profound than before. Men knelt or stood, their muskets resting on the earth or the fence rails, their fingers on triggers, their eyes measuring the distance, waiting for the order that would unleash the storm they had been holding back all day. The clock of history seemed to stop, poised on the edge of the steep green slope of Breed's Hill. The advance of the British lines was not a sprint, but a stately, dreadful procession. Weighed down by their heavy packs, navigating through tall grass and climbing over or breaking down fences, the regulars maintained their discipline with admirable stoicism. The American artillery, 2 small field pieces in the redoubt, opened fire with little effect. The gunners were inexperienced and the guns poorly served. The British artillery, dragged up the hill with immense effort, also struggled. Their 6-pounders were firing ball which embedded itself harmlessly in the soft earth of the rebel works, instead of the grape shot that would have scourged the parapets. This failure of the Royal Artillery was the first hint that the day's script might not unfold as written. Still, the lines came on. The distance closed. 300 yards, 250. The silence from the American lines was unnerving. No defiant shouts, no scattered, premature shots. It was the silence of a coiled spring. On the beach, the British flanking column encountered Stark's wall. The New Hampshire men, packed 3 deep behind their rough stone barrier, watched as the grenadiers and light infantry, confident and compact, came into view around a slight bend in the shoreline. The British, seeing the obstruction, did not break stride. They assumed it was a mere impediment, manned by the same militia who would break at the sight of a bayonet. Charge. They prepared to storm it. At a command, they levelled their bayonets and charged. They closed to within 50 yards, then 40, then 30. The air was still. Then, Stark's voice cold and clear. Fire. The front rank of Americans erupted in a single searing blast of flame and lead. The effect was catastrophic at such close range. The tightly packed British column was scythed down as if by a giant's hand. Officers leading from the front were primary targets and fell in heaps. The charge faltered, stunned by the volume and accuracy of the fire. Before the smoke could clear, the first rank of Americans stepped back to reload, and the second rank stepped forward. Another volley, equally devastating, tore into the reeling mass. Then the third rank fired. It was a rolling, continuous slaughter. The survivors broke and fled back down the beach, leaving a tangled windrow of red-coated bodies on the stones and sand. In a few minutes, Stark had shattered the British Army's best hope for a quick victory. The flank was not turned, it was held, and at a terrible price. On the main hill, the 2 central attacks met a similar, if slightly delayed, fate. Howe's and Pigot's men, struggling through the final fences in the increasingly steep grade, now faced the full length of the American line. The order to fire rippled along the breastwork and the redoubt. It was not a single crashing volley like Stark's, but a tremendous rolling roar that ran for hundreds of yards. A wall of lead slammed into the advancing scarlet lines. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Whole sections of the British line seemed to melt away. Officers, conspicuous on horseback or waving swords, were shot down with deliberate precision. Major Pitcairn, who'd been at Lexington, fell mortally wounded. The lines shuddered, came to a halt, and then, their cohesion shattered by the loss of leaders and the sheer weight of fire, began to fall back down the hill. The retreat was not a panic, but a bloody, stumbling withdrawal under a continuing hail of musketry. The slope, which had been so difficult to climb, was now littered with the dead and wounded in brilliant red coats, a grim tapestry against the green grass. The Americans, many of whom had never been in battle before, watched with a mixture of exultation and awe. They had done it. They had stood against the British regulars and thrown them back. In the British camp at the landing zone, the scene was one of shock and disbelieving fury. General Howe, miraculously unscathed, though every aide around him had been hit, was stunned. The easy victory he had anticipated was a bloody illusion. The professional pride of the army was now deeply, personally wounded. There was no question of calling off the assault. To do so would be to concede a moral victory to the rebels that could unravel the entire siege. The lines must be reformed and they must go again. This was the moment where the battle transitioned from a tactical engagement to a brutal test of wills. Officers, their voices hoarse with shouting, rallied their shattered companies. Stragglers were pushed back into line. The walking wounded helped the more seriously injured to the rear. The drums began to beat once more, a sound now more grimly determined than confident. The survivors fixed bayonets, their faces set in masks of anger and resolve. They would not be beaten by farmers. They would not. On the hill, the American elation was tempered by a grim reality. Their ammunition was running perilously low. The promised resupply had not come. Men began to count their remaining cartridges. 5, 4, 3. Prescott and his officers moved among them, urging calm, ordering them to scavenge from the dead and wounded, to be prepared to use stones if need be. The respite was brief. They watched as the scarlet lines once more began their ascent. This time the British advance was slower, more deliberate. Their artillery had been repositioned, and this time it found its mark, firing grape shot that whipped through the American lines, causing grievous wounds. The fire from the American works was still fierce, but it was sparser, less coordinated. Again, the British lines marched into a storm of lead. Again, they were decimated, particularly in the front ranks. And again, their cohesion broke, and they retreated down the bloody slope, leaving yet another layer of their comrades on the field. The hill was now a charnel house. The air, thick with smoke, smelled of burnt powder, blood, and the sweet, nauseating scent of torn grass. 2 assaults had been shattered. The Americans, exhausted, thirsty, and nearly out of powder, clung to their works, wondering how much longer they could hold, and what would happen when the red lines inevitably came a third time. The lull that followed the second, staggering British repulse was not a silence of peace, but the quiet of a ghastly interval. The slope of Breed's Hill, from the American ditch to the orchards and fences halfway down, was a tableau of unspeakable suffering. The scarlet coats of the fallen and wounded dotted the green expanse like poppies in a macabre harvest. Moans and cries for water, for mothers, for mercy, rose in a low, persistent chorus that cut through the smoke-hazed air. On the British side, the professional army was in a state of profound shock. They had done everything by the book, formed lines, advanced with discipline, presented bayonets, and the book had lied. The myth of militia fleeing before the majesty of a regular advance lay shredded among the bodies on the hillside. For the officers, particularly General Howe, this was a personal and professional catastrophe in the making. His command was littered with the corpses of his friends and the flower of his army. The cost of persisting was unthinkable. The cost of retreating, in terms of imperial prestige and the future of the rebellion, was unimaginable. Howe stood amidst the shattered remnants of his staff, his uniform smudged with powder and dirt. The easy confidence of the morning was gone, replaced by a grim, almost feral determination. To retreat now was to grant the rebels a victory that would echo across every colony, convincing thousands more to take up arms against a force that could be beaten. The political calculus in London would be brutal, Gage would be recalled, and he, Howe, would be seen as the man who failed. There was only one path, a third assault, but it could not be a repetition of the first two. The tactics had to change. The solution, born of desperate necessity, was both simpler and more brutal, shed all unnecessary weight. Officers ordered the men to drop their heavy packs, leaving them in untidy piles at the base of the hill. They would go up with musket, bayonet and cartridge box alone. Furthermore, the focus of the attack would shift. The American left at the rail fence had proven a rock. The redoubt, though deadly, was a fixed, confined space. The weak point, Howe and his surviving subordinates reasoned, was the junction between the breastwork and the redoubt, and the open ground to the south of the redoubt itself, where the defences were thinner. They would concentrate their force for a final, furious push against the heart of the position, with a secondary pressure against the breastwork to prevent reinforcements. In the American redoubt, the atmosphere was one of grim triumph fraying at the edges into desperation. They had done the impossible, twice. A fierce, proud energy coursed through the men. They had seen the backs of the British regulars. But this energy was rapidly depleting its physical fuel. The cry now was not for more resolve, but for more powder. Men were down to their last few cartridges, some to only 1 or 2. They rifled the pouches of the few American wounded and dead, sharing out precious paper cartridges with the solemnity of communicants. Water was non-existent, throats were parched to cracking, tongues swollen. The heat, the exertion, the adrenaline crash combined to create a lethargic exhaustion. Prescott, his voice raw from shouting, moved among them, his presence a pillar. But even his unwavering demeanour could not manufacture ammunition from the air. Messengers had been sent, but the response from the rear was mired in confusion and a fatal lack of urgency. The battle had become a race between British reorganisation and American resupply, and the Americans were losing. Adding to the complexity was the arrival of more men, but not in the coordinated relieving waves that were needed. Small groups and individual companies, drawn by the sound of battle and a belated sense of crisis, trickled onto the peninsula. Many were fresh and eager, but they entered a scene of apocalyptic strain without clear direction. Some joined the lines at the breastwork or the rail fence, where ammunition was slightly more plentiful. Others clustered in the rear of the redoubt or on Bunker Hill, a confused mass of spectators and potential reinforcements who lacked the command structure to be deployed effectively. This highlighted the fatal flaw in the American system that day. There was no overall commander on the field. Prescott commanded the redoubt. Stark and Knowlton commanded the left, but no one commanded the entire Charlestown position. General Israel Putnam, a fiery and energetic figure, rode between Bunker Hill and the rear, exhorting men forward, but he lacked the authority to force the coordination of supplies or to organize a structured relief. The result was a heroic but fragmented defense, its parts strong but its system failing. Most poignant was the situation of Dr. Joseph Warren. Having fought as a private in the redoubt throughout the heat of the battle, he had been repeatedly urged to leave, to preserve himself for the political leadership the cause desperately needed. He had refused. Now, as the lull stretched, a friend pressed a canteen of water into his hand and again begged him to retire. Warren, his face smudged with powder, took a sip and handed it back. "It is sweet," he is reported to have said, "to die for one's country." He then took up a musket from a fallen man and resumed his place on the firing step. His decision was not one of military logic, but of symbolic necessity. He was the revolution incarnate in that moment, the intellectual, the leader, choosing to stand shoulder to shoulder with the farmer and the blacksmith, sharing their fate to the utmost. His presence was a powerful, unspoken bond, but it also underscored the direness of the hour. If a man of his stature saw no alternative but to fight to the death, what hope was there for a timely rescue? The British preparations reached their climax. The lines were formed once more, thinner now but more focused. The light infantry and grenadiers, their numbers dreadfully reduced, were folded into the main assault forces. The artillery, at last correctly loaded with grapeshot, was wheeled into new, enfilading positions. On the American side, the final warnings came. Lookouts reported the enemy dropping their packs, a certain sign of an all-or-nothing charge. The word was passed in hushed, urgent tones. Prepare to receive a bayonet charge. Wait for the order. Aim low. Men tightened their grips on their now precious muskets. Those with no ammunition looked for rocks, for the butt ends of their weapons, resigning themselves to a final, brutal hand-to-hand struggle. The sun, beginning its descent toward the west, cast long, dramatic shadows across the torn landscape. The moans from the hillside seemed to grow louder, a dreadful lament for what was about to be added to their number. In the redoubt, Prescott looked out at the gathering scarlet lines below, then back at the faces of his men, dirty, exhausted, resolute. No orders, no reinforcements were coming. They were alone on their dirt hill at the end of their tether, awaiting the final, decisive push of a wounded and furious empire. The British advance, when it came, possessed a different character altogether. Gone was the stately ceremonial march of the first assault. This was a slow, deliberate, and ominously quiet approach. The drums beat a sombre, funereal pace. The men, stripped of their packs, moved with a lethal purpose, their eyes fixed on the silent earthwork atop the hill. They utilized the terrain for cover where they could, moving in short rushes from fence line to ditch, their bayonets catching the late afternoon sun. Most terrifying of all was the repositioned Royal Artillery. This time, the British guns had been brought up to a point on the American left, from where they could fire grape shot directly down the length of the breastwork and into the open flank of the redoubt. As the infantry advanced, these guns opened up with a roar, their charges of small iron balls sweeping the American parapets like lethal hail. For the defenders, this was a new and devastating horror. Men who had survived the massed musket volleys were now cut down in clusters by the cannon's scourging fire. The defensive line, already strained, began to physically crumble in places under this hammering. Inside the redoubt, the final crisis of ammunition arrived. As the British closed to within 100 yards, then 80, the American fire, once a continuous roar, became a sputtering, sporadic crackle. Entire sectors of the wall fell silent as men frantically searched empty pouches or turned to their neighbours only to receive a helpless shrug. Powder, for God's sake, powder, became the desperate cry, but there was none to be had. The deadly discipline of holding fire until the last moment had been correct, but it had exhausted their meagre stock just as the enemy, learning from its mistakes, pressed home its most determined assault. Prescott, seeing the inevitable, gave the only order left: prepare to repel. Bayonets! Use the rocks! Men grasped the loose stones from the ditch, hefted the butts of their now useless muskets, and braced themselves. The psychological breaking point had been reached not through cowardice but through simple logistical failure. The rebellion's first major battle was to be decided not by a lack of courage but by a lack of gunpowder. The British lines, sensing the diminishment of fire, let out a roar, a combination of rage, relief, and pent-up fury. They broke into a run, a final bayonet-tipped surge up the last 50 yards of slope. They poured over the ditches and against the walls of the redoubt. At the breastwork and the fence line, where some ammunition remained, the fighting was still ferocious, and the British advance was checked with heavy loss. But at the redoubt itself, the epicenter of the American defense, the end had come. The first British grenadiers, faces contorted with effort, scrambled over the parapet. The fighting inside the small, Square descended into a savage close-quarters melee. There were no elegant volleys now, only the sickening thud of musket stocks on skulls, the grunts and screams of hand-to-hand combat, the flash of bayonets in the dusky interior. Prescott, with immense physical courage, was in the thick of it, using his sword to parry and thrust, shouting for his men to retreat. The order was not one of defeat, but of preservation. To stay was to be slaughtered to the last man for no strategic gain. It was in this chaotic, brutal climax that Dr. Joseph Warren met his fate. As the British flooded into the redoubt, he was one of the last to leave, firing his final shot before turning. As he stepped over the parapet to join the retreat, a British officer recognized him or simply marked him as a target. A musket ball struck Warren in the back of the head, killing him instantly. He fell just outside the works he had helped to defend. His death was not a public martyrdom witnessed by all, but a sudden, violent end in the smoke and confusion. It would take hours for the British to identify his body, and days for the news to spread through the colonies. But when it did, the symbolic power of his sacrifice would be immense, transforming a military setback into a potent legend of patriotic devotion. In that moment, however, it was merely another death in a sea of death, a private tragedy in a very public cataclysm. The retreat from the redoubt was the most perilous moment of the day for the Americans. Exhausted, many without weapons, they streamed out of the rear opening and across the open ground toward the shoulder of Bunker Hill. The British, exhausted themselves and momentarily disordered by their costly success, were slow to organize a pursuit. This delay was critical. It allowed the American lines at the breastwork and rail fence, which were still holding, to act as a shield. These units, under Stark and Knowlton, maintained their discipline, firing controlled volleys that kept the British advance in check and covered the retreat of their comrades from the redoubt. This was perhaps the greatest tactical achievement of the day, a staged fighting withdrawal under extreme pressure, executed not by a regular army but by citizen soldiers. They gave ground stubbornly, turning again and again to fire, making the British pay for every yard. The retreat was not a rout, it was a grudging, bloody concession of a position that could no longer be held, fought with a professionalism that belied their amateur status. The battle for Breed's Hill was over. The battle for survival and for the meaning of what had just occurred had begun. The collapse of the redoubt sent a seismic wave through the entire American line. The sight of their compatriots streaming rearward, combined with their own dwindling ammunition and the relentless pressure of Howe's reinvigorated infantry, made the positions at the breastwork and the rail fence untenable. Yet there was no panic. Orders, echoed by Stark, Knowlton and their junior officers, rang out to retire in good order. The withdrawal from these forward lines became a textbook example of how a militia, when well led, could perform as well as regulars. Companies retreated by platoons, one rank firing while the other fell back, then turning to cover their comrades in turn. They used every fence, every dip in the ground, every stone wall as a momentary bastion from which to sting their pursuers. The British advance, though victorious, remained cautious and bloody. They had learned the price of overconfidence on this hill, and the continued disciplined fire from the retreating Americans ensured the lesson was reinforced with every step. The funnel point of the retreat was the narrow strip of land known as Charlestown Neck, less than 100 yards wide at high tide, with the Charles River on one side and the Mystic on the other. Here, the final potential for disaster loomed, a disorganized mob pressing onto. The neck could have been decimated by the guns of the British ships in the Charles, turning a retreat into a massacre. But American foresight and British oversight prevented this. Earlier in the day, some reinforcements and a few cannon had been positioned on the high ground of Bunker Hill, overlooking the neck. These guns, though few, provided a symbolic threat. More importantly, the British Navy, perhaps constrained by tide, depth, or a simple failure of communication with the army, did not bring its ships in close enough to enfilade the retreating columns with full effect. The crossing of the neck was tense and hurried, under sporadic cannon fire that kicked up geysers of dirt and water, but it was not the killing zone it might have been. On the slopes of Breed's Hill, the British army stood victorious, but the victory field was a scene from a nightmare. The cost was staggering. Over 1,000 British soldiers and officers lay dead or wounded, nearly half the force engaged. Entire companies had been virtually annihilated. The elite grenadier and light infantry battalions were shattered. The grass was slick with blood, the air thick with the sounds of suffering. The professional exultation of taking an enemy position was utterly drowned in the scale of the loss. General Howe, surveying the carnage from the captured redoubt, was under no illusions. He had been given the hill, but at a price that felt like ruin. There would be no vigorous pursuit to crush the rebel army at Cambridge. His men were spent, physically and morally. The army's fighting spirit, while not broken, was deeply bruised. Orders were given to consolidate on the captured ground, tend to the wounded, and secure the peninsula. The dream of a swift war-ending coup de main had died with the hundreds of men strewn across the hillside. For the Americans, the retreat coalesced into a defensive line in the mainland, from Prospect Hill to Winter Hill, a stronger and more defensible position than the exposed peninsula. The mood was a complex stew of emotions. There was profound disappointment and anger at the loss of the ground they had fought so hard for. There was grief for friends left behind, for the revered Dr. Warren. But there was also, undeniably, a new-found and formidable confidence. They had faced the best of the British army, inflicted casualties at a rate of nearly 3 to 1, and had only retreated when their ammunition was literally gone. They had not broken. They had withdrawn. In the camps that night, stories were exchanged of Stark's wall on the beach, of Prescott's calm on the parapet, of the way the redcoats fell like grass before a scythe. A narrative was being forged in real time. They could stand against them. They could hurt them. The battle, though a tactical defeat, was being metabolized as a profound psychological and strategic victory. The immediate fallout was a crisis of command and supply for the Americans, but also a sudden, fierce unity. The obvious failures, the lack of coordinated reinforcements, the criminal shortage of ammunition on the hill, led to furious recriminations, but also to immediate reforms. The Continental Congress, upon hearing the details, would accelerate the sending of powder and shot. The provincial authorities became ruthless in their requisitions. The near disaster underscored the absolute necessity of a unified professional command structure, lending urgency to the appointment just days later of a new commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, George Washington, who was even then travelling north from Philadelphia. The Battle of Bunker Hill in its bloody aftermath did not dishearten the rebellion. It legitimized it. It proved the war would be long, costly, and fought against a capable and brave enemy, but it also proved that victory was not a fantasy. The British, holding the charred hills of Charlestown, looked out at a rebel army that was no longer a mob but a tested and dangerous foe. The lines were drawn, not just around Boston, but in the minds of men on both sides of the Atlantic. A rebellion had become a war. Nightfall on June 17, 1775, brought no respite to the Charlestown Peninsula. Fires still smouldered in the ashes of the town, casting a flickering, hellish glow. The wounded, both British and American, filled the night with their agonized cries. For the British, the task of succor was overwhelming. Their own medical corps was small, and the sheer number of casualties, many with terrible musket wounds at close range, meant that suffering was prolonged and mortality would be high. American wounded who could not escape were made prisoners, facing an uncertain fate in the overcrowded and unsanitary prisons of Boston. Among the dead, a grim search began. British officers moved among the bodies, identifying friends and subordinates. It was in this grisly process that General Howe learned of the death of Dr. Warren, his body identified by a loyalist who knew him. Howe, according to accounts, expressed regret, calling Warren's death a great loss. The body was stripped of its clothing by looters, but was later given a proper burial by the British, a nod to the respect even an enemy could command. In the American lines, the night was spent in frantic reorganization, alert for a follow-up attack that never came. The stories of the survivors began to harden into legend. Prescott's heroism was universally hailed. His decision to hold fire until the last moment was already being enshrined as tactical gospel. The phrase, "don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," though likely apocryphal and attributed to several officers, perfectly encapsulated the lesson of disciplined fire that had been so brutally taught. The death of Warren became the central, tragic motif of the day. The news spread like a shadow, deepening the resolve of those who heard it. He had been the revolution's brightest intellectual light, and he had extinguished it not in a council chamber but in the dirt of a fortification. His martyrdom provided a sacrificial heart for the cause, an emotional anchor around which to build a national mythology. For the British High Command gathered in Boston, the victory celebration was hollow. General Gage, in his official report to London, would frame the action as a success, the ground taken, the enemy driven, but the subtext screamed from the casualty returns. The army in Boston was crippled. The officer corps had been decimated, a loss not just of lives but of experience and leadership that would take years to replace. The strategic picture had barely changed. The Americans still held the mainland in a tight siege, and now they held something far more dangerous, proof of their own efficacy. The council of war in the days that followed was sombre. The aggressive strategy of breaking the siege by seizing outer heights was discredited. Howe, Clinton and Burgoyne were united in one opinion: Boston was a trap. The peninsula offered no strategic advantage, and holding it required the navy and exposed the army to constant threat. The idea of evacuating the city, unthinkable before June 17th, now entered serious discussion. Across the Atlantic, when the news arrived weeks later, the reaction was bifurcated. King George III and his hawkish ministers saw only the victory, the ground taken, the rebels put to flight. But in Parliament, the opposition, led by figures like Edmund Burke and Charles James Fox, seized on the casualty figures. They argued that a victory purchased at such cost against mere colonists was a portent of disaster. If it took over 1,000 casualties to take one hill from farmers, what would it take to subdue an entire continent? The political foundations for a long war were being laid in London's drawing rooms, with Bunker Hill as the first bloody exhibit. The battle had successfully demonstrated American resolve to the one audience that mattered most, the British government itself. It made the prospect of reconciliation more remote and that of a protracted, expensive war more likely. In the colonies, the response was unequivocal. Newspapers from New Hampshire to Georgia printed exaggerated accounts of British losses and heroic American stands. The narrative was not of a defeat, but of a glorious, defiant stand. Recruitment, which had been steady, now surged. The timid were emboldened, the undecided were swayed. The Continental Congress, acting with new vigour, issued a declaration causes for taking up arms, justifying the conflict. The battle had provided the necessary crucible. It had transformed abstract principles of liberty into concrete, shared sacrifice. It had created common heroes and a common enemy. The loose collection of colonies began in that summer of 1775 to think of itself as something new, a nation at war. The hills of Charlestown were lost, but the cause they defended had been immeasurably strengthened, baptized in fire and validated in blood. The rebellion now had its foundational story of courage and sacrifice, its bloody shirt to wave, and its unshakable knowledge that the British army was not invincible. The days following the battle were a study in grim aftermath. The British, now in control of the entire Charlestown Peninsula, set about fortifying Bunker and Breed's Hills with a zeal born of painful experience. They built stronger, more sophisticated works than the Americans had managed in a single night, a tacit admission of the new respect they held for their enemies' capabilities. The body of Joseph Warren, initially buried in a common grave, was later exhumed and identified by his dental work. He had a distinctive false tooth by his friend and fellow patriot, Paul Revere, who had skill as a silversmith and dentist. This macabre identification served as a final, intimate postscript to the battle, connecting the artisan class directly to the sacrifice of the intellectual elite. Warren's remains were eventually reinterred with honor, his grave becoming a pilgrimage site. Within the American camp, the inquest began. While public sentiment was celebratory, the military and political leaders engaged in sharp, often acrimonious debate. Who was to blame for the failure to reinforce? Why was ammunition not forwarded? General Artemus Ward bore the brunt of the criticism. His caution was now painted as incompetence or worse. His health, always fragile, deteriorated under the strain. The battle effectively ended his tenure as the primary commander, clearing the path for the arrival of a new supreme authority. The officers who had been on the Hill, Prescott, Stark, Putnam, saw their reputations and influence soar. They became the new military aristocracy of the Revolution, their authority earned in the crucible of combat rather than granted by political committee. This shift from political to martial prestige was a critical evolution in the army's character. The tactical lessons were absorbed with the speed of necessity. The value of entrenchments was seared into the American military mind. Washington, upon his arrival in July, would make the fortification of Dorchester Heights his first strategic priority, applying the lesson of Bunker Hill in reverse. The importance of logistics, of a supply chain for ammunition and food, was now understood as a fundamental element of command, not an administrative afterthought. The battle also solidified a tactical doctrine for the Continental Army: fight from cover, leverage marksmanship, avoid open field engagements with British regulars until properly trained, and make the enemy pay for every inch of ground. It was a defensive, attritional strategy that would define the war's northern campaigns. For the common soldier, the battle was a transformative, personal ordeal. Men who had been farmers weeks before had now faced the concentrated violence of modern warfare. They had seen friends torn apart by cannon fire, had killed other men at close range, had experienced the unique terror and exhilaration of combat. This shared trauma created bonds of camaraderie that would hold the army together through the terrible trials of the coming years, the retreat from New York, the freezing misery of Valley Forge. They were no longer a militia, they were veterans. They had a measured respect for the enemy's courage and discipline, but also a confirmed contempt for his tactical rigidity. This complex veteran's perspective would be their greatest asset. Finally, the battle altered the psychological landscape irrevocably. Before June 17th, there was still a lingering hope in some quarters, both in London and in the colonies, that the conflict could be resolved without full-scale war. The Olive Branch petition was still on its way to the king. Bunker Hill ended that ambiguity. It was a point of no return. The king would declare the colonies in open rebellion, and the colonists would respond with a fierce determination to see the struggle through. The hill itself became a symbol. For the British, it was a monument to the folly of underestimation and the terrible price of empire. For the Americans, it was a symbol of sacrifice and a proof of concept. The name Bunker Hill would resonate through the decades, a shorthand for courageous defeat that nourishes eventual victory. It was the battle that gave the rebellion its spine, its mythos, and its grim awareness of the price of liberty. The war for independence, in a very real sense, began not with the signing of a document in 1776, but in the smoke and chaos of a half-dug redoubt on a forgotten pasture in 1775. The world had turned, and the echo of the volleys fired that day would reverberate long after the last body was buried and the last cannon withdrawn. The humid stillness of July 1775 settled over the siege lines around Boston, a silence that was not peaceful but ponderous, heavy with the memory of recent thunder. Into this fraught landscape, on the second day of the month, rode a man whose presence would alter the character of the war and the meaning of the sacrifice on Charlestown Heights. George Washington, appointed by the Continental Congress as Commander-in-Chief of the newly designated Continental Army, arrived at Cambridge to take command. His journey from Philadelphia had been a procession of public hope, but his private thoughts, recorded in his correspondence, betrayed a profound anxiety. He was taking command not of an army, but of a concept, a political abstraction given momentary bloody form on a hill. The reality that greeted him was a sobering corrective to any revolutionary idealism. Washington found a force that was less a unified military body and more a temporary civic gathering with muskets. Discipline was ephemeral, based on personal respect for company officers, rather than a code of martial law. Enlistments were short, many set to expire, at the end of the year, creating a revolving door of manpower. The men were scattered across a wide arc of encampments, living in a haphazard collection of tents, barns, and hastily built huts, their sanitation poor and their organisation loose. Most critically, the logistical apparatus was nearly non-existent. The near-catastrophic shortage of powder experienced at Breed's Hill was not an anomaly, but the daily condition of the army. Washington's first inventory revealed only 9 rounds of ammunition per man, a supply that would not sustain 30 minutes of serious combat. The victory of morale won on June 17th was balanced on a razor's edge of material insufficiency. The new commander-in-chief brought with him a Virginia planter sense of order, a French and Indian war veteran's understanding of formal warfare, and a Roman Republican's conception of civic virtue. He was appalled by the New England egalitarianism he witnessed, the casual familiarity between ranks that he saw as destructive to discipline. His ambitions were monumental, to create from this raw and headstrong material an army capable of standing toe-to-toe with the British military machine. His fears were equally vast, that the enterprise would collapse not from enemy action but from internal dissolution, from a failure of the colonies to support their own cause with men, money, and material. The contradictions within him mirrored those of the cause itself, a conservative man leading a radical revolution, a slaveholder fighting for liberty, a proponent of European military discipline relying on the fervour of citizen soldiers. Washington's arrival forced a subtle but significant shift in the narrative of Bunker Hill. For the New England officers and men who had fought there, it was their battle, their story of local heroes and local sacrifice. Washington, an outsider, needed to subsume that local pride into a national narrative. He paid public homage to the courage displayed, praising Prescott and Warren in his general orders. But privately, he and his staff saw the battle as an example of what happened without centralized command and strict discipline, a heroic but ultimately futile stand that sacrificed valuable ground and men due to poor coordination. The battle became a lesson, a case study in the manual of the new army he was determined to build. This created a hidden tension between the existing, battle-tested New England leadership and the new, aristocratic Virginians and Southerners on Washington's staff, who often viewed their northern comrades with a mixture of respect and condescension. The strategic picture Washington inherited was, ironically, crystallized by the very battle that had been lost. The British, traumatized by their losses, had abandoned any aggressive designs against the American lines. They remained, as General Clinton had presciently warned, pent up in Boston, masters of a charred peninsula and a besieged town. Their hold was now purely naval. By land they were impotent. Washington's task, therefore, was not to win a battle, but to win a siege, to make the British position so untenable that they would be forced to evacuate. And the key to this, as every officer who had seen the lay of the land understood, was the same geographic imperative that had sparked the June 17th engagement, the command of heights. Breed's Hill had been a premature and exposed move. The true prize looming to the south across the harbour was the higher, more defensible Dorchester Heights. The ghost of Bunker Hill now dictated Washington's first major strategic decision. He would succeed where the earlier effort had been forced into failure. He would take and fortify Dorchester Heights, but he would do it with the full weight of his entire army, with overwhelming force, and with the element of surprise restored. The memory of the earlier battle hung over the planning, a silent tutor in the costs of half measures and the absolute necessity of powder and ball. The weeks following Washington's arrival were a season of grim transformation, a slow, grinding war of administrative will against the entropy of a popular uprising. The commander's mansion in Cambridge became the nerve centre of this effort, where the ideals of the Enlightenment collided with the stubborn realities of human nature and scarce resource. Washington's first general orders were a manifesto of his intentions: strict schedules for roll calls and inspections, regulations against gambling, profanity and drunkenness, directives on sanitation and the digging of proper latrines. He demanded the construction of a more coherent defensive line, linking the various hills and redoubts into a continuous barrier. To the independent-minded Yankees, many of whom had enlisted to fight redcoats, not to dig ditches, these orders seemed the petty tyrannies of a distant aristocrat. The hidden tension between revolutionary liberty and military necessity, always present, now had a face and a name: General Washington. The logistical nightmare was the true enemy. Washington's letters to the Congress in Philadelphia were a litany of desperate need. "The want of powder," he wrote, "is inconceivable." He dispatched agents throughout the colonies and to the West Indies, begging, buying, and sometimes commandeering saltpeter, lead, and powder. The shortage of arms was just as critical. Men with fowling pieces or no guns at all were of little use. The supply of food, while better than that of munitions, was irregular and threatened by profiteering. The Army's commissary and quartermaster departments, run by political appointees with little experience, were chaotic and often corrupt. Washington, who had managed the complex business of Mount Vernon, was frustrated to the point of despair by the inability of the colonial governments to act with the efficiency his situation demanded. The alliance of colonies was being tested not by British bayonets but by wagon shortages and unreliable contractors. Within the officer corps, rivalries festered and ambitions simmered. The New England officers who had borne the heat of the first battles felt a proprietary claim to the army and its glory. They watched as Washington filled his immediate family with men from outside the region: the brilliant, ambitious Adjutant General Horatio Gates, the young French enthusiast artilleryman Henry Knox, and a coterie of Virginians and Pennsylvanians. Artemus Ward, though nominally second in command, was sidelined, his health and his cautious style at odds with Washington's drive. John Stark, the hero of the rail fence, had already returned to New Hampshire in a dispute over rank and commission, a stark reminder that provincial pride could trump continental unity. Israel Putnam, beloved by the men for his blustery courage, was seen by Washington and his aides as undisciplined and unreliable. The battle had created heroes, but it had not created a harmonious command structure. Washington's challenge was to harness their popular appeal while instilling a chain of command that ran through him alone. The psychological strain on the common soldier evolved from the acute terror of battle to the chronic anxiety of camp life. The initial adrenaline of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill had faded, replaced by the dull routines of picket duty, drill, and labor on the fortifications. Disease, dysentery, typhoid, and the ominously named putrid fever began to stalk the camps, claiming more lives than British muskets had. Men from rural farms grew homesick as the summer wore on, their thoughts turning to unplanted fields and families left to manage alone. The cause that had seemed so clear and urgent in April and June now felt distant, abstracted into the drudgery of military life. Desertions, a trickle after Bunker Hill, became a steady stream. Washington responded with increasing severity, ordering public lashings and, in some cases, executions for desertion. The moral ambiguity of the revolution deepened. They were fighting against tyranny, yet their own commander was forced to use the lash and the noose to hold his army together. The noble citizen soldier was being transformed, often against his will, into a component of a military machine. Yet, amidst this grinding pressure, the legend of Bunker Hill performed a vital, unifying function. Campfire tales of that day served as a foundational myth for the new army. The raw recruit from Pennsylvania or Maryland, listening to a Massachusetts veteran describe the packed lines of redcoats, the silence before the volley, and the final desperate fight in the redoubt, was undergoing an initiation. He was being grafted into a shared story of sacrifice and courage that transcended his colony of origin. The death of Joseph Warren in particular became a universal symbol. Here was a man who had everything to lose: position, wealth, family, and had chosen to lose it all on that hill for the principle of self-government. His story was repeated as a secular sermon, a reminder that the cause was worth the suffering in the camps and the terror of battles to come. Bunker Hill was no longer just a battle. It was the anchor of the army's identity, the proof that they were capable of greatness, and the warning of the price it would demand. It was the past that justified the painful present and the uncertain future. Across the water in Boston, a parallel drama of disillusionment and strategic paralysis unfolded within the British High Command. The victorious army was, in truth, a convalescent force. The hospitals were overflowing, and the burial details had worked for days. The morale of the rank and file, once buoyant with contempt for the rebels, was now shadowed by a new and grudging respect. They had learned that the American militia, when dug in, could fire with a speed and accuracy that their own rigid platoon volleys could not match. For the officers, the atmosphere was one of bitter frustration. The glorious charge up the hill had won them a patch of dirt and a colossal butcher's bill, but it had not broken the siege. General Gage, the conciliator, was now utterly discredited. His reports to London tried to put the best face on the victory, but the casualty figures spoke for themselves. In October, his recall would arrive, a quiet end to a tenure that had begun with hope and ended in bloody stalemate. Command devolved upon General William Howe, the reluctant hero of Breed's Hill. The experience had left a profound mark on him. The bold, aggressive officer who had scaled the heights of Abraham had been replaced by a more cautious, even hesitant commander. Bunker Hill taught him that frontal assaults against entrenched Americans were a form of military suicide. This lesson, born of trauma, would dictate his strategy for the remainder of his time in America, leading to missed opportunities and a reputation for lethargy that would later baffle and infuriate his subordinates and his government. For now, his ambition was tempered by the sight of so many dead grenadiers. His fear was of another such Pyrrhic victory. The contradiction in Howe was now laid bare. A brave tactical fighter who had become a strategically risk-averse commander, a man whose personal courage was forever separated from his operational daring by the memory of a single afternoon. The British Army settled into an uneasy occupation. Boston, crowded with troops, loyalist refugees, and a sullen, rebellious populace, became a miserable and unhealthy place. Food grew scarce as the American blockade, while porous, tightened its grip. Fuel was scarce. Troops cut down trees and even dismantled abandoned houses for firewood. The once bustling port was idle, its wharves quiet but for the movement of naval vessels. Smallpox broke out, adding biological terror to the economic depression. The British, masters of the seas, were prisoners of the land. Their strategy, as it crystallized in the councils of war, was no longer to break out, but to hold on, to maintain a foothold in North America until a grand strategy could be devised and massive reinforcements arrived. Boston had transformed from a strategic base into a symbolic hostage, a piece of ground they could not afford to abandon for reasons of prestige, yet could not effectively use for reasons of practical military logic. Within this confined space, the internal conflicts among the British commanders grew more pointed. Henry Clinton, the intellectual, had argued for a wider flanking manoeuvre on June 17th and continued to advocate for more dynamic action, such as a landing in the American rear. John Burgoyne, the playwright general, composed dramatic critiques of the stalemate and dreamed of the sweeping campaigns that would later lead him to Saratoga. Howe, now in charge, resisted their prodding. The rivalry was not one of personal animosity, but of competing military philosophies. Clinton represented the school of maneuver and strategic creativity. Howe, after his searing experience, represented the school of caution and concentration. Their debates in the headquarters on Boston's Beacon Hill were a microcosm of the wider British strategic confusion, whether to treat the rebellion as a localized insurgency to be crushed with terror, or as a continental war requiring grand, patient campaigns. Bunker Hill had made the former option seem unacceptably costly, and the latter had not yet been fully conceived. For the common British soldier and the loyalist civilian trapped in Boston, the aftermath of the battle was a time of deepening gloom. The victory parade never materialized. Instead, they faced a monotonous and deteriorating existence. The loyalists, who had thrown in their lot with the crown, watched with sinking hearts as the British army showed no signs of crushing the rebellion, but instead seemed content to sit and starve. Their property in the countryside was being confiscated by rebel committees. Their future was tied to an empire that appeared impotent. The soldiers, bored and beset by disease, their pay often in arrears, grew restless. Desertions from the British ranks, though less publicized than from the American, began to occur. Men slipped away into the Massachusetts countryside, some to make new lives, a few to join the very rebels they had been sent to subdue. The aura of invincibility was gone, replaced by a weary sense of a war with no clear objective and no end in sight. The hill they had taken at such cost now stood behind them, a silent, grass-covered monument not to their triumph, but to the beginning of their long, frustrating ordeal. As the summer of 1775 hardened into fall, the Battle of Bunker Hill ceased to be a recent event and began its journey into the realm of political symbolism and propaganda. Its facts were malleable, its meaning contested by both sides to serve present needs. In London, the government of Lord North used Gage's initial sanitised reports to proclaim a firm victory. The taking of the hill was emphasised, the staggering casualties were minimised. It was presented as proof that the rebellion, though stubborn, could be quelled with sufficient force. The opposition, however, seized on the casualty lists obtained through back channels. Edmund Burke, in powerful speeches in the House of Commons, used Bunker Hill as his central argument. What? 10,000 men slain and a hill taken? And is this the system by which we are to govern America? An army afraid to stir, and an enemy every day gathering strength. The battle became a fulcrum in the parliamentary debate, hardening the positions of both sides and making compromise in London politically impossible. In the American colonies, the narrative was refined and broadcast with evangelical zeal. Newspapers, pamphlets, and sermons transformed the raw, chaotic experience into a parable of Republican virtue. The focus shifted from the loss of the ground to the magnificence of the stand. The specific order to hold fire until point-blank range became a universal metaphor for the discipline and moral superiority of the free citizen soldier over the automatons of a tyrannical regime. The death of Warren was elevated to a central, Christ-like sacrifice. He was portrayed as the beautiful martyr of liberty, his death a deliberate offering upon the altar of freedom. This narrative was not merely celebratory, it was instrumental. It was used to recruit soldiers, to shame the hesitant, and to raise funds and supplies. "Remember Warren" became a potent rallying cry. The battle's anniversary would be marked in the coming years with orations and sermons, cementing its place in the revolutionary calendar. This process of myth-making, however, began to obscure the actual military and political lessons of the day. The near disastrous failures of command and logistics were glossed over in favour of celebrating individual heroism. The real strategic consequence, the psychological locking of the British Army into Boston, was understood by commanders but less so by the public. The myth also created dangerous expectations. It fostered a belief that fighting from entrenchments was a surefire recipe for success, an assumption that would lead to tragedy at Forts Washington and Lee in New York a year later. It also promoted an underestimation of British adaptability. The legend of Bunker Hill risked making the Americans overconfident, believing they had discovered a simple formula to defeat the world's greatest military power. The battle also forced a subtle but profound shift in the rhetoric of the cause. In the spring of 1775, the language was largely one of defence and restoration, defending traditional English liberties against ministerial overreach. After Bunker Hill, with its massive mutual bloodletting, the possibility of a peaceful restoration of the old constitutional relationship seemed fantastical. The scale of the violence had created a chasm that petitions and appeals could no longer bridge. Thomas Paine, arriving in America later that year, would find fertile ground for his arguments in common sense. The experience of Bunker Hill gave visceral, emotional weight to his intellectual case for separation. How could one be reconciled to a mother country that sent its sons to slaughter yours on a Massachusetts hillside? The battle began to move the cause from an argument about taxation and representation toward a struggle for outright national independence. Furthermore, the international audience took note. Reports of the battle circulated through the courts of Europe. To the French and Spanish, ancient enemies of Britain, the details were electrifying. The colonists had not only rebelled but had stood and fought, inflicting catastrophic losses on a British army. It was the first tangible evidence that the American rebellion was a serious affair, a potential drain on British resources and a possible opportunity for revenge. French agents in America began sending more detailed reports to Versailles, and clandestine discussions about providing aid to the rebels gained a new urgency. Bunker Hill did not win French support, but it made that support conceivable. It transformed the American rebels from a group of rustic protesters into a potentially useful geopolitical tool, a credible military force whose success could alter the global balance of power. The echo of the volleys on that hill, therefore, was heard not just in London and Philadelphia, but in the gilded halls of Paris and Madrid, where old empires began to calculate new possibilities. The long, tense autumn bled into a bitter winter, and the siege of Boston became a war of endurance. For Washington's army, encamped in crude shelters, the lessons of Bunker Hill were applied with cold, logistical precision. The commander's obsession with artillery, sparked by the helplessness of having only 2 ineffectual guns in the redoubt, found its agent in Henry Knox. In a feat of almost mythical exertion, Knox, the portly Boston bookseller, turned colonel of artillery, journeyed to Fort Ticonderoga in New York and, through a Herculean effort, transported over 50 cannon and mortars, the captured noble train of artillery, over 300 miles of frozen rivers and snow-clogged roads back to Cambridge. These guns were the material answer to the question posed by Breed's Hill: how to command the heights with undeniable force. The plan to occupy Dorchester Heights was conceived with a meticulous attention to detail that stood in stark contrast to the improvised operation of June. Where Prescott had worked with 1,000 men in secret, Washington would employ thousands, openly and with overwhelming support. The ground, frozen solid, would be overcome with prefabricated fortifications, gabions, wicker baskets filled with earth, and chandeliers, wooden frames to support protective walls, were constructed out of sight behind the American lines. The assault on the heights would be preceded by a massive nights-long bombardment of the British positions in Boston and on Charlestown Neck to distract and wear down the enemy. Every cart, every ox, every pound of powder was accounted for. This was not a daring raid by citizen soldiers. It was a set-piece military operation by an emerging professional army, its blueprint drawn from the negative spaces of the Bunker Hill disaster. On the British side, the winter deepened their misery and strategic impotence. General Howe, now officially Commander-in-Chief after Gage's departure, proposed nothing more aggressive than a few small, unsuccessful raids for fodder. His army shivered, and his navy captains fretted about the narrowing, ice-choked channels of the harbour. The memory of Bunker Hill acted as a passive deterrent. The thought of assaulting another set of American fortifications built with the same desperate energy but now doubtless better armed and supported was abhorrent. Howe's inaction was a backhanded tribute to the effectiveness of the American stand. The hill they had taken had taught him to fear the hills they might yet take. His strategy narrowed to a single grim hope, to hold on until spring, when reinforcements might allow him to evacuate with some semblance of honour. The night of March 4, 1726 was a deliberate echo and a calculated reversal of June 16, 1775. Under cover of a heavy bombardment and a bright concealing moon, a workforce of over 2,000 American troops and 300 ox carts silently ascended the heights of Dorchester. They moved with a disciplined quiet that would have gratified Washington. Through the night, they assembled their prefabricated works and dug frantically into the still frozen earth. When dawn broke on March 5th, the anniversary of the Boston massacre, a stunned British command looked out to see a miracle of military engineering. 2 formidable forts crowned Dorchester Heights. Their cannon, Knox's cannon, dozens of them, trained directly on the city and the fleet. The reaction in Boston was one of sheer disbelief. Admiral Molyneux Shaldham reported to Howe that his ships could not remain in the harbour if those guns opened fire. Howe was faced with a stark choice: another Bunker Hill or humiliation. To storm the heights would require an even more complex amphibious assault across the harbour, followed by an uphill charge against works that were stronger than Breed's Hill, and manned by a now veteran army. The cost, he believed, would be even greater than the first. The other option was to leave. This time there was no council of war filled with aggressive juniors. The memory of the previous June's carnage settled the debate. Howe gave the orders to prepare for evacuation. On March 17, 1726, after a 10-month siege that had been decisively shaped by the events of a single June day, the British Army and over 1,000 Loyalist refugees boarded their ships and sailed out of Boston Harbour, bound for Halifax, Nova Scotia. They left behind a town and a hill, both scarred, both silent. The victory was Washington's, but its precondition was the sacrifice on Breed's Hill. The first major campaign of the war had ended in a profound American triumph, a triumph made possible because a previous bloody defeat had taught both sides indelible lessons about the nature of the conflict they were waging. The price of the hill had purchased the city. The evacuation of Boston in March 1726 was not a retreat in the face of battle, but a concession to a strategic reality forged 9 months earlier on the slopes of Breed's Hill. As the last British transport disappeared over the horizon, the silence that descended upon the harbour was profound, a void where the constant pressure of occupation had been. For the citizens of Boston, emerging from their homes like survivors after a long storm, the emotion was a complex relief, tinged with the scars of hardship and the divisions the siege had etched into their community. For the Continental Army, marching in to reclaim the cradle of the rebellion, it was an unambiguous triumph, their first major victory. Yet, within that victory lay the unresolved ghost of the battle that had made it possible. The charred timbers of Charlestown still poked from the earth. The fresh British fortifications on Bunker and Breed's Hill stood as alien artifacts on the landscape, tombstones for the men who had fallen to take and then hold them. The physical space was reclaimed, but its meaning was now permanently split, a site of American defiance and a site of British trauma. George Washington understood the propaganda value of the moment. He entered Boston not as a conqueror but as a liberator, to the cheers of a populace grateful for their deliverance. He was careful to honour the local heroes, paying public respect to the memory of Joseph Warren and the valour of the Massachusetts regiments. But his gaze was already turning south to New York, where he rightly guessed the British would strike next with their main force. The lessons of Boston, the absolute necessity of commanding heights, the power of well-served artillery, the tenacity of entrenched infantry, were codified in his mind. Yet the victory also contained a dangerous seed of overconfidence. The army and the public had seen the British leave. The narrative of Bunker Hill as a moral victory had been validated by the subsequent strategic victory. A belief began to crystallize, untested and perilous, that the British could be made to quit the field through stalemate and positional warfare. This belief would soon be shattered on the open ground of Long Island and Manhattan, where Howe, chastened by one hill, would refuse to give battle on anything resembling American terms. For the British Army, nursing its wounded pride in Halifax, the post-mortem of the entire Boston campaign was inextricably linked to the analysis of June 17th. The official reports had spoken of victory, but the officer corps knew the truth. They had been fought to a standstill by amateurs, and their response had been paralysis. The debate over what went wrong at Bunker Hill became a proxy for a larger strategic argument. The conservatives, exemplified by Howe, drew the lesson that direct assaults were prohibitively costly. The radicals, like Clinton, argued that the failure was one of imagination, that the assault should have been wider, supported by more amphibious hooks, that the rebels' flanks should have been turned not just on the beach but on a grand operational scale. This doctrinal split would plague British command for the remainder of the war. Howe's subsequent campaigns in New York and Philadelphia would be marked by a pattern of brilliant manoeuvre to gain positional advantage, followed by a reluctance to deliver a final, crushing blow, as if the ghost of the grenadiers falling on the hillside stayed his hand at the moment of decision. The social and political reverberations of the battle continued to unfold. In England, the opposition's use of the casualty figures had shifted the burden of proof onto the North Ministry. No longer could they claim the rebellion was the work of a few hotheads. It was clearly a popular cause defended with shocking ferocity. This led not to a desire for reconciliation, but to a hardening of purpose. The decision was made to escalate dramatically, to send a massive armada, to hire German mercenaries to treat the colonies not as wayward children but as a foreign enemy to be subdued by overwhelming force. Bunker Hill had made a peaceful resolution politically impossible in London. It had proven the rebels were serious and therefore had to be destroyed. Paradoxically, the battle that showcased American courage made a brutal, protracted war inevitable. Within the American camps, the veterans of the fight began to assume a distinct, almost priestly status. They were the men who had been there, who had seen the whites of their eyes. Their authority was experiential, not theoretical. As the army regrouped and new recruits poured in from the middle and southern colonies, these New England veterans became the indispensable non-commissioned backbone, the carriers of the nascent army's culture and its hard-won tactical catechism. They distrusted open field formations, prized the shovel as much as the musket, and had a measured, unsentimental respect for British infantry in the attack. This culture clash would continue as the Continental Army evolved into a more professional force under Baron von Steuben, but the gritty, defensive-minded ethos born in the redoubt and at the rail fence never fully disappeared. It became the bedrock of the American military tradition, a preference for pragmatism over pageantry, for victory through survival and endurance rather than decisive Napoleonic confrontation. The battle had, in a very real sense, given the United States its first enduring military temperament. The long-term strategic impact of the Battle of Bunker Hill was not in the ground held or lost, but in the psychological calculus it imposed on both commanding generals for the rest of the war. For George Washington, the battle was the negative blueprint against which he measured his own army's capabilities and limitations. It taught him the critical importance of multiple defensible escape routes, a lesson he applied brilliantly in the retreat from Brooklyn Heights across the East River in 1776, a maneuver that saved the Continental Army from annihilation. It seared into him the vital necessity of artillery, leading him to consistently favour and promote gifted artillerymen like Henry Knox and later the Frenchman Lafayette. Most profoundly, it instilled in him a deep, abiding caution about the fighting quality of his own men in the open field. When he gambled on a conventional European-style attack at Germantown in 1777, the resulting confusion and defeat only reinforced his belief that the American strength lay in a war of posts, of harassment, and of strategic patience, a Fabian strategy that would wear down the British will. Bunker Hill was the first data point in a grim equation that led to Valley Forge and the eventual triumph at Yorktown. For Sir William Howe, the shadow of the battle was longer and darker. The experience transformed his military character. The dashing young officer who had led the line at Quebec was buried on Breed's Hill. In his place was a commander haunted by the spectre of catastrophic loss. His subsequent campaigns were masterpieces of manoeuvre designed to avoid another such bloodbath. At the Battle of Long Island, he outflanked and routed Washington's army but refused to order a final assault on the fortified American lines on Brooklyn Heights, perhaps envisioning a replay of the June slaughter. At White Plains, he again declined to storm a strong American position. His capture of New York and Philadelphia were triumphs of logistics and positioning, but they lacked a decisive, war-ending battle. His critics, both contemporary and historical, accused him of lethargy, of missing chance after chance to crush the rebellion. But to Howe, these were not chances. They were traps. The memory of the perfectly disciplined lines disintegrating under close-range musketry had become a paralyzing doctrine. Bunker Hill had won the Americans a psychological advantage over their most consistent opponent, an advantage that lasted until Howe's resignation in 1778. The battle also fundamentally altered the British approach to fortifications and light infantry. The humiliating failure of the elite grenadiers and light infantry in the initial assaults led to a re-evaluation of their training and use. The British Army began to place greater emphasis on light infantry tactics, looser formations, aimed fire, use of cover, directly imitating the methods the Americans had used so effectively. Simcoe's Queen's Rangers and other loyalist units would become adept at this irregular style. Furthermore, the power of field fortification so dramatically demonstrated was not lost on British engineers. In later campaigns, from the defence of Newport to the construction of the massive defences at Yorktown, the British became avid diggers themselves, using the spade to consolidate gains and protect against the very kind of punishing musketry they had endured. The pupil had, in some ways, begun to learn from the master, albeit reluctantly. On a grand strategic level, the battle convinced the British government that subduing America required a different kind of war. The lesson they took was not to avoid battle, but to avoid battles against entrenched rebels without overwhelming force and a plan to cut off their retreat. This led to the strategy of 1777, Burgoyne's thrust south from Canada to sever New England, coordinated with a move up the Hudson by Howe from New York. The plan was elegant on paper, a classic pincer movement, but it was born from a desire to avoid more Bunker Hills by isolating and capturing the rebel army's stronghold without costly frontal assaults. The failure of that coordination, in part due to Howe's decision to go to Philadelphia instead, led to the disaster at Saratoga, which in turn brought France into the war. Thus, one can draw a direct line from the British reaction to Bunker Hill to the strategic overextension and diplomatic catastrophe that ensured American independence. Finally, the battle reshaped the internal politics of the rebellion. It discredited the cautious, defensive strategy of New England leaders like Artemus Ward and elevated aggressive, though often politically problematic, figures like Benedict Arnold, who shared the relentless offensive spirit that had driven the decision to fortify Breed's Hill. It created a template for the citizen soldier as hero, a model that would frustrate Washington as he tried to build a professional, long-service army, but would also provide a powerful democratic myth for the new nation. The men of Bunker Hill had not been regulars. They were the people in arms. This image became central to American identity, fueling the distrust of standing armies that would be codified in the Second Amendment and shaping the nation's military policy for generations. The battle, therefore, was not just a military event but a political and cultural genesis, its legacy etched into the very DNA of the United States' relationship with war, military power, and its own founding story. In the years immediately following the war, as the new nation groped towards unity and identity, the Battle of Bunker Hill underwent a process of sanctification. The raw, chaotic, and near-disastrous event was smoothed into marble. The first major monument to the battle, an 18-foot wooden pillar with a gilt urn, was erected on Breed's Hill in 1794 by the King Solomon's Lodge of Freemasons to honour their fallen brother Joseph Warren. It was a modest beginning for what would become a national obsession with memorialising the event. The battle's location itself became a site of pilgrimage. Veterans, now aging, would return to point out where they had stood, their personal memories blending with the growing legend. The story was simplified in the telling: the cunning Yankees, the foolish British, the glorious sacrificial stand. This process was actively shaped by the surviving participants and early historians. Generals like Henry Dearborn and others wrote memoirs and gave speeches that solidified the popular narrative. The phrase "don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," though of disputed origin, was firmly attached to Prescott and became a universal shorthand for the battle's core lesson of discipline. The complexities, the command confusion, the desertions, the brutal British learning curve were washed away. What remained was the foundational myth of national birth, a David and Goliath story that served a young republic in need of heroic origins. The battle was celebrated in paintings, poems and orations every June 17th, its anniversary a rival to the 4th of July in the early republic's patriotic calendar. The physical landscape of the battlefield, however, refused to conform to the neat myth. Charlestown was rebuilt, its streets laid out in a new grid that encroached upon the slopes of Breed's Hill. The redoubt was ploughed over, the rail fence and stone wall on the beach lost to development and the shifting shoreline. The Bunker Hill Monument Association, formed in 1823 by leading citizens including Daniel Webster, sought to reclaim this history from oblivion. Their ambitious plan was not for a statue, but for a great obelisk, a permanent piercing statement in granite. The cornerstone was laid in 1825 in a ceremony featuring the Marquis de Lafayette, then on his triumphal tour of the nation he helped create. The aging French hero's presence linked the battle to the broader international struggle, cementing its place as the opening act of a world historical drama. The construction of the 221-foot granite obelisk, completed in 1843, was itself a national endeavour, fraught with financial struggles and engineering challenges. When it was finally dedicated, the oration was delivered by Daniel Webster, whose thunderous rhetoric served as the final, definitive consecration of the battle in the American imagination. He painted the fighters not as rebels, but as defenders of principle, their cause sanctified by blood. "Let it rise," he boomed of the monument. "Let it rise till it meet the sun in his coming. Let the earliest light of the morning gild it, and parting day linger and play on its summit." The monument physically anchored the myth, imposing a singular, soaring narrative on a messy patch of ground. It turned a hill of pasture and clay into America's secular Golgotha. Yet, even as the monument rose, the battle's meaning began to fracture along the new nation's most dangerous fault line. By the 1840s and 1850s, as the debate over slavery tore at the Union, both North and South sought to claim the legacy of the Revolution for their cause. Abolitionists used the battle's rhetoric of liberty to condemn slavery. Southern apologists argued their ancestors had fought for self-determination, a principle they now invoked for secession. The spirit of '76 was invoked by all sides. The memory of Bunker Hill, a unifying national myth in the early republic, became a contested symbol in a nation hurtling towards civil war. The obelisk on the hill stood not just as a marker of past unity, but as a silent witness to its unravelling, a reminder that the liberties won by blood could be interpreted in tragically different ways. The professional historical scrutiny of the Battle of Bunker Hill began in earnest in the late 19th century, as the passions of the Civil War cooled and a more empirical, document-driven approach to history took hold. Scholars like Richard Frothingham and Henry B. Dawson meticulously dissected the surviving records, letters, orderly books, pension applications, and British War Office files. Their work began to peel back the layers of myth. They questioned the iconic quotes, debated the exact troop placements, and revealed the stark failures in the American chain of command. The battle emerged from this scholarship as a more complex, more human, and ultimately more interesting event. It was no longer a simple fable of patriotic virtue, but a case study in the chaos of war, the fragility of militia, and the profound psychological impact of combat on both victor and vanquished. This revised understanding influenced military academies on both sides of the Atlantic. At West Point, Bunker Hill was studied not as a mythic stand but as a tactical problem. Cadets were taught the consequences of poor reconnaissance, the importance of securing flanks, the value of field works, and the lethal effectiveness of concentrated musketry against massed formations. It became a classic example of a Pyrrhic victory, taught alongside such battles as Malplaquet and the Charge of the Light Brigade. In British staff colleges, the battle was analysed as a cautionary tale about underestimating an enemy and the dangers of frontal assault. The professional soldiers of the modern era saw in the battle not just a story of national birth, but a repository of timeless military lessons about leadership, logistics, and the friction of war. The 20th century, with its world wars and totalitarian ideologies, cast the battle in yet another light. In the context of the fight against fascism, the citizen soldiers of Bunker Hill were recast as early defenders of democracy against tyranny. Their stand was seen as a precursor to the struggles at Thermopylae, the Alamo, and Dunkirk, a story of free men making a conscious choice to resist overwhelming power. This interpretation reached its apotheosis during the Cold War, where the battle served as a potent symbol in the ideological struggle against Soviet communism. It was presented as evidence of the American character, self-reliant, defiant, and willing to sacrifice for the principle of self-government. The monument on the hill was not just a tourist site but a Cold War shrine, a physical rebuttal to the collectivist monuments of the Eastern Bloc. Archaeology and preservation efforts in the latter half of the 20th century added a new, tactile dimension to the history. Surveys and digs, though limited by the urban setting, attempted to locate the precise contours of the redoubt and the breastwork. These efforts were a struggle against time and development, a literal digging for truth beneath the accumulated layers of myth and cityscape. The establishment of the Bunker Hill Monument as part of the Boston National Historical Park in 1974 formalized its status as the site of national memory, but also as the subject of ongoing historical inquiry. The park's interpreters now face the challenge of presenting a nuanced story that honored the sacrifice while acknowledging the historical complexity, the desertions, the British perspective, the role of enslaved and free black soldiers who likely fought on the hill but were written out of the early narratives. Perhaps the most profound modern re-evaluation has been the attempt to recover the battle's human cost in individual terms. Genealogists and historians have worked to compile more complete rosters of the fallen, giving names and stories to the numbers. This work restores the particularity of the loss, the farmer from Dedham, the young apprentice from Boston, the Scottish Grenadier from the Highlands, the loyalist civilian caught in the burning of Charlestown. This granular focus serves as an antidote to the abstract monumentalizing tendency. It reminds us that history is not made by forces or spirits, but by individuals, each with their own ambitions, fears, and contradictions, who were swept up into a cataclysm on a hot afternoon in June. The battle meaning, therefore, continues to evolve, residing not in a single set story, but in the ongoing dialogue between the soaring obelisk on the hill and the quiet, stubborn facts being unearthed beside it. The enduring significance of the Battle of Bunker Hill lies not in its tactical outcome, but in its unique position as a transformative paradox. It was a defeat that fueled a victory, a slaughter that inspired a nation, a local skirmish that altered global history. It stands as the definitive example of a loss that wins, a concept that would become deeply embedded in the American military ethos from the Alamo to Khe Sanh. The battle taught the nascent United States that victory could be measured in something other than ground held. It could be measured in will demonstrated, in an enemy spirit broken, in the proving of one's own mettle. This willingness to accept terrible costs for strategic or moral gains became a recurring and often troubling feature of the American way of war. The battle also cemented a powerful and enduring archetype, the American citizen soldier. The Minuteman of Lexington and Concord was a fleeting symbol. The defender of Bunker Hill was a more substantial, more dramatic figure. He was not a professional, but a civilian who took up arms in a moment of supreme crisis, performed with incredible courage and competence, and then, in the ideal, returned to his plough. This image became central to national identity, fostering a deep-seated distrust of standing armies and a belief in the martial virtue of the common man. It is an image that has been invoked in every major conflict since, from the doughboys of World War I to the greatest generation of World War II, even as the nature of warfare made the citizen soldier an increasingly antiquated model. The myth of Bunker Hill continues to shape how America sees itself at war, as a reluctant giant compelled to action, whose strength lies in the moral resolve of its ordinary people. For the military historian, the battle is a fascinating hinge point between two eras of warfare. It was one of the last great battles where the linear tactics of the 18th century, lines of infantry advancing with bayonets, clashed decisively with the emerging power of aimed infantry fire from cover. It previewed the slaughter that would mark the Napoleonic Wars and later the American Civil War, where technology began to favour the defender. The British, in their stubborn bravery, were fighting a battle that was already becoming obsolete. The Americans, in their pragmatic use of terrain and firepower, were stumbling toward the future. In this sense, Bunker Hill is not just an American story, but a chapter in the global evolution of combat. On a human level, the battle's legacy is one of sober reflection on the nature of courage and the price of principle. The men on that hill were not superhuman. They were tired, scared, thirsty, and many of them eventually ran. Their heroism was not the absence of fear, but the action taken in spite of it. Joseph Warren's death is poignant not because he was a flawless martyr, but because he was a man of intellect and position who chose to stand in the dirt with the possibility of death, a choice that resonates with timeless moral weight. The battle forces us to ask, what is worth such a cost? When is a principle so vital that it demands the ultimate price? These are not historical questions, but perennial ones. Finally, the battlefield itself, now nestled in a dense urban neighbourhood, serves as a powerful metaphor for memory and history. The soaring obelisk of the 19th century, the preserved townhouses of the 18th, the bustling city streets of the 21st, all coexist on that small peninsula. The past is not dead here, it is layered, contested, and continuously reinterpreted. The Battle of Bunker Hill endures because it is not a closed book. It is a story we return to, finding in its drama and its tragedy, its clarity and its confusion, a mirror for our own times. It reminds us that nations are born not in pristine myth, but in the messy, bloody, courageous, and contradictory actions of flawed human beings, who on a single day, on a hill overlooking a city, stepped into the forge of history and were forever changed, leaving a legacy that continues to shape, challenge, and define the nation they helped to create. The Battle of Bunker Hill, stripped of its monument and myth, endures as a profound study in the anatomy of a historical moment. It was an event that should not have happened as it did. Born from a midnight disobedience of orders, decided by a logistical failure, and concluded with a victory so costly it felt like defeat. Its participants, from the resolute Prescott to the traumatized Howe, were propelled by forces, political, social, and psychological, that they only partially understood. They made decisions in the fog of war and the heat of ambition that cascaded into consequences far beyond the tactical disposition of troops on a peninsula. To examine the battle's ultimate meaning is to grapple with this cascade, to trace the ripples from that day forward through the life of a nation and the craft of history itself. It is to understand that what began as a maneuver to preempt an enemy became the crucible in which the American Revolution was transformed from a protest into a war of endurance, and the American character received one of its defining, if ambiguous, imprints. The battle's most immediate philosophical legacy was its brutal education in the nature of revolutionary violence. Before June 17, 1775, the conflict retained a quality of political theatre. The staged confrontations of Lexington and Concord, the posturing of siege lines. Bunker Hill revealed the true sanguinary face of the struggle. It demonstrated to both sides that this would be a war not of gentlemanly manoeuvres and negotiated truces, but of attrition and profound sacrifice. For the Americans, it destroyed any lingering illusion that the British would back down after a symbolic show of force. For the British, it shattered the comforting notion that the colonists were an unruly mob that would disperse before the majesty of a professional army. The battle served as a violent rite of passage, forcing a psychological break with the past. After such bloodshed, there could be no simple return to the status quo ante bellum. The bridge of peaceful reconciliation, already frayed, was burned in the conflagration of Charlestown and the red mud of the redoubt. This hardening of purpose had a correlative effect on the political rhetoric of the cause. The language of the rebellion evolved from a defense of Englishmen's rights to a more expansive and potentially revolutionary discourse of natural rights and inherent liberty. The sheer stoic courage of common men standing against the world's finest army lent a powerful emotional validity to abstract Enlightenment principles. If a farmer from Pepperell or a silversmith from Boston could willingly face that storm of shot for a principle of governance, then that principle must be of transcendent importance. The battle provided a visceral, corporeal argument for the ideas that Thomas Jefferson would later enshrine in the Declaration of Independence. It proved that the commitment to these ideas was not merely intellectual, but physical and mortal. The pursuit of happiness was given weight and substance by the bodies on Breed's Hill. The consent of the governed was paid for in blood before it, was articulated in parchment. Furthermore, the battle irrevocably altered the social contract within the American ranks. The deference due to officers in the European model was based on birth, purchase, or royal commission. At Bunker Hill, authority was earned in real time, under fire. Prescott commanded because he stood firm. Stark commanded because his cool pragmatism saved the flank. Knowlton commanded because his men followed him. This created a proto-meritocratic ethos that would deeply influence the developing American military and, by extension, its society. The hero was not the aristocrat in the rear, but the man who shared the danger. This ethos fed the anti-aristocratic sentiment that became a hallmark of early American politics and reinforced the democratic tendencies of the new nation. The battle, in a sense, was a democratic event, a collection of individuals making a collective, voluntary stand, their leaders emerging from their own ranks, not by decree but by demonstrated courage and competence. Yet, for all its democratic sheen, the battle also revealed the inherent tensions and limitations of a popular uprising. The desertions, the failure of coordination, the agonizingly slow response from headquarters, all these were the wages of an army that was a political entity first and a military instrument second. The battle argued powerfully for the necessity of centralization, discipline, and a professional command structure, an argument that George Washington would take to heart and impose, often painfully, on the Continental Army. Thus, the legacy of Bunker Hill is dual. It is both the apotheosis of the citizen soldier and the strongest possible case for moving beyond him. It celebrates the minute man even as it demonstrates why he must be superseded by the continental regular. This paradox lies at the heart of America's enduring and often conflicted relationship with its military, a romantic attachment to the militia myth coexisting with a practical reliance on professional force. The battle stands as the origin point of this enduring national conversation. The memory of Bunker Hill, as it has been curated and contested over 2.5 centuries, serves as a masterclass in the uses of the past. Every generation has visited that ground and returned with a story tailored to its own needs. For the revolutionary generation, it was a painful but necessary sacrifice, a story of martyrdom and tested resolve used to bolster a fragile union. For the Whig historians of the early 19th century, it was a morality play about liberty versus tyranny, a clear-cut chapter in the unfolding story of human progress. For the post-Civil War nation seeking reconciliation, it became a story of shared Anglo-Saxon courage, a battle where both sides fought bravely for their convictions, thus allowing a reunified America to honor all its ancestors. In the 20th century, it was molded into a symbol of democratic resistance against totalitarianism, a timeless lesson in the power of free men defending their soil. This malleability reveals that the true Battle of Bunker Hill is not a fixed set of facts, but a relationship between the past and the present. The monument on the hill is not merely a marker of what happened, it is a statement of what a later generation believed was important to remember. Daniel Webster's dedication oration in 1843 was less about 1775 than about 1843, a plea for national unity in the face of growing sectional strife, using the founder's sacrifice as a rebuke to contemporary disunion. The preservation of the battlefield in the 20th century was an act of patriotic affirmation during the Cold War, an assertion of the nation's ancient and virtuous roots in contrast to godless communism. Each act of commemoration says as much about the commemorators as it does about the commemorated. The battle also occupies a unique space in the popular imagination because of its dramatic, almost theatrical structure. It has a clear 3-act play, the stealthy overnight preparation, the tense anticipation as the British assemble, and the explosive, repetitive violence of the assaults. It has archetypal characters, the steadfast farmer Prescott, the brilliant martyr Warren, the determined professional Howe, the pragmatic frontiersman Stark. It has iconic, if apocryphal, dialogue. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. It has a stark symbolic landscape, a grassy hill, a humble fort, a burning town. This inherent narrative power has made it a perennial subject for painters like John Trumbull, poets like Ralph Waldo Emerson, and filmmakers alike. It is history that conforms to the rules of drama, making it an exceptionally potent vessel for carrying meaning. Yet, the professional historian's task has been to complicate this clean narrative, to restore the fog, friction, and ambiguity. Scholarship has illuminated the role of forgotten participants. The African Americans, both free and enslaved, like Peter Salem and Salem Poor, who fought on the hill and were later celebrated for their bravery. It has examined the experience of the common British soldier, often a poor Scot or Irishman with no personal stake in subduing colonists, who nonetheless advanced with terrifying discipline into the slaughtering fire. It has probed the agonizing decisions of the loyalists in Boston, watching their town burn and their cause seemingly stagnate. This recovery of multiple perspectives does not diminish the battle's significance. It enriches it, transforming a patriotic monologue into a complex human conversation. It reminds us that history is not a single story told by the victors, but a collision of countless individual stories, full of fear, courage, confusion, and conviction. Ultimately, the battle resists a single, definitive interpretation because it was itself a paradox. It was a defeat that felt like a victory that felt like a defeat. It was a display of amateurism that achieved professional results, and a demonstration of professional prowess that ended in amateurish strategic paralysis. It was an act of supreme collective will riddled with individual failure. This paradoxical nature is perhaps its most enduring gift to posterity. It refuses to be simplistic. It forces us to hold competing truths in our minds simultaneously: courage and fear, victory and loss, myth and reality. The granite obelisk points steadfastly to a single soaring conclusion, but the ground at its base, where men truly fought and died, whispers a more complicated, more human, and ultimately more meaningful story. To consider the strategic legacy of Bunker Hill is to trace a thread through the tapestry of American military history, a thread that is sometimes bright, sometimes dark, but always present. The central, harrowing lesson that entrenched, determined infantry armed with muskets could decimate even the bravest. Assault became a foundational dogma for the United States Army in its defensive campaigns. It informed the stubborn, costly Union stands at Fredericksburg and Gettysburg, where the ghosts of the British regulars seemed to march again into the muzzles of entrenched, rifled muskets. The American military mind developed a profound appreciation for the power of the prepared defense, an appreciation that would find its terrible apotheosis in the trench warfare of World War I, and later in the entrenched perimeters of Khe Sanh or the Korengal Valley. Conversely, the British trauma seeded a caution in their military tradition when facing determined defenders, a caution that could be seen in the meticulous set-piece artillery barrages that preceded infantry advances on the Western Front, a desperate attempt to avoid another such bloodletting by obliterating the defensive position beforehand. The battle therefore influenced not just American but British and by extension Western military thought. It was an early and gruesome data point in the evolving relationship between firepower and maneuver, a relationship that continues to define combat. The image of the thin red line breaking against the earthwork became a cautionary icon in military academies across the world. On a deeper level, the battle embedded a particular strategic mindset in the American prosecution of war, a bias toward the attritional over the decisive. Washington, after Bunker Hill and the disaster in New York, concluded that his army was the revolution, and thus its preservation was the paramount strategic objective. He would not risk it in a grand climactic battle unless conditions were nearly perfect. This led to a strategy of evasion, harassment, and survival, a strategy that won independence but established a pattern. From the Union's Anaconda Plan in the Civil War to the gradual grinding material superiority of World War II and the policy of containment during the Cold War, American strategy has often favored the slow, sure pressure of economic and logistical power over the dramatic, decisive battlefield gamble. The Bunker Hill mentality is not one of flashy genius, but of stubborn endurance, of believing that if you can just hold on, dig in, and make the cost too high, you will eventually prevail. It is the strategy of the besieged becoming the victor through sheer tenacity. This legacy, however, has a shadow side. The celebration of the defensive stand can lead to a passive strategic posture, a willingness to cede the initiative to the enemy. It can foster an over-reliance on technology and firepower to reduce risk to one's own forces, sometimes at the expense of political objectives. Furthermore, the myth of the citizen soldier's triumph can create unrealistic expectations about the nature of modern warfare, where the complexities require long-term training and professional specialization. The battle's lesson, that willpower and a good position can overcome disparity in training, is a dangerous one if applied uncritically to later, more complex conflicts. Finally, Bunker Hill established the principle that for America, the psychological dimension of warfare could be as important as the physical. The battle was not won by capturing ground, but by capturing the imagination. It convinced the Americans they could fight, and it convinced the British the fight would be long and hard. Every war since has involved a struggle for this psychological high ground, the management of public opinion, the demonstration of resolve, the will to bear casualties. These intangible factors so decisively shaped on that June day have become central elements of American strategy. The battle taught that wars are won not just on maps, but in the minds of soldiers, civilians, and politicians. In an age of instant global communication and information warfare, this psychological legacy of Bunker Hill is perhaps more relevant than ever. The hill was not just a piece of terrain, it was the first major battlefield in America's long war of ideas. The human geography of the Battle of Bunker Hill, the way it compressed profound human experiences into a tiny, indelible space, offers a final lens through which to comprehend its enduring hold. The peninsula itself became a microcosm of the Revolution's grand themes. On the heights, the act of digging the redoubt was a literal grounding of abstract political theory. They were carving out a space for self-determination with their shovels. The slope became an altar of sacrifice, where the principle of liberty transitioned from word to flesh. The narrow neck was the fragile connection between danger and safety, between commitment and escape, mirroring the tenuous unity of the colonies themselves. The surrounding waters patrolled by warships represented the overwhelming power of empire, which could be observed, challenged from shore but not yet defeated. Within this compressed arena, every human emotion of war played out at an accelerated, almost novelistic pace. There was the quiet anxiety of the night march, the determined focus of the digging, the soaring pride of seeing the works take shape at dawn, the gut-churning fear as the boats landed, the fierce exultation of the first repulse, the creeping dread as ammunition dwindled, the savage chaos of the final melee, and the exhausted, bittersweet relief of the retreat. Men experienced the full arc of combat in less than 24 hours. This intensity burned the experience into individual and collective memory with a unique clarity. It was not a long campaign of maneuver and fatigue, but a sharp, shocking, and complete episode of violence, making it perfectly shaped for retelling and remembrance. The battle also functioned as a brutal social leveler. In the redoubt, a Harvard-educated president of a provincial congress stood shoulder to shoulder with an illiterate farmer. Their social distinctions, so pronounced in peacetime, were rendered irrelevant by the shared task of loading and firing, by the shared risk of the cannonball and the bayonet. Death, when it came, was no respecter of class. It took the celebrated doctor and the anonymous private with the same indifference. This fleeting frontline democracy was a powerful, if transient, realization of the revolutionary ideal. It proved that when survival was the only goal, the essential qualities were courage, steadiness, and loyalty to the man beside you, qualities distributed without regard to station or wealth. Yet this levelling was only partial and temporary. Off the hill, the old structures reasserted themselves. The command failures were failures of a system still wrestling with hierarchy and local autonomy. The distribution of glory afterward followed familiar patterns. The officers received the lasting fame, while the common soldiers faded into the collective they of history, their individual names preserved only in pension records and genealogical searches. The battle, therefore, captures the American Revolution in microcosm, a radical event that promised equality, presided over by men who were, by and large, conservative in their social views, an explosion of democratic energy that was soon channeled into new, more stable but less egalitarian institutions. Today, standing on the summit of Breed's Hill, one is surrounded by this layered past. The obelisk, a product of 19th century nationalist fervour, points skyward. The rebuilt streets of Charlestown, with their brick row houses, speak of a community that endured and regenerated. The view of the Boston skyline is a testament to the prosperous, powerful nation that grew from this violent birth. The quiet park at the base of the monument where children play and tourists stroll is a testament to the peace that was eventually won. The ground itself holds the silence of those who fell. To be there is to exist in all these times at once, to feel the ambition of the builders, the grief of the survivors, the curiosity of the visitor, and the silent presence of history. The battle is not over here. It has simply been translated from sound into stone, from action into memory, from a moment in time into a permanent feature of the American soul. It reminds us that places are not just locations, but repositories of time, and that some pieces of earth are forever changed by what happened upon them. In the final accounting, the Battle of Bunker Hill escapes simple categorization. It was not the beginning of the war, nor the end. It was not a decisive victory, nor a crippling defeat. Its significance lies in its function as a catalyst, an event of such concentrated violence and symbolic power that it accelerated historical processes, hardened attitudes, and forged new realities. It was the moment the American Revolution became irrevocably a war. It was the moment the British government realized it faced a rebellion of substance, not sentiment. It was the moment the colonists saw themselves not as petitioners, but as combatants in a struggle for existence. The battle's enduring meaning for the United States is rooted in its foundational contradictions. It is a story of loss that nourishes a narrative of victory. It celebrates the amateur while making the case for the professional. It is a tale of collective action built upon 1,000 individual decisions, many of them fearful or flawed. It honors the elite leadership of a Warren while sanctifying the common sacrifice of the unnamed. This capacity to contain opposites, to be both a triumph of the underdog and a tragedy of miscalculation, is what gives the story its resilient power. It feels true because it is complex, because it reflects the messy, costly and courageous nature of building something new. For the world beyond America, Bunker Hill announced the arrival of a new kind of political force. It demonstrated that the ideas of the Enlightenment were not just philosophical parlor games. They were principles for which men would die in rows, and for which they could kill with terrifying efficiency. It signaled that the age of empire would face a new challenge, the age of national self-determination. The sight of a citizen army standing against the might of Britain inspired observers from Paris to Warsaw, planting seeds that would flower in later revolutions. The battle was a local event with global echoes, a shot that was heard not just around the 13 colonies, but around the Atlantic world. On a human level, stripped of all political and military analysis, the battle endures as a timeless meditation on courage. Not the courage of the unafraid, but the courage of the terrified who hold their ground. It is about the moment of choice, to run or to stand, to fire or to flee, to lead or to follow. In the faces of Prescott's men, waiting in the silent redoubt, we see the universal face of the soldier at the crisis point. Their experience transcends nationality and century. It connects to the hoplite at Thermopylae, the legionary at the Teutoburg forest, the doughboy in the Argonne, the marine at Iwo Jima. Bunker Hill is one chapter in the long, terrible and awe-inspiring story of human conflict, a story of fear mastered, duty honoured, and limits tested. Thus, the battle does not belong solely to the historians, the soldiers, or the patriots. It belongs to anyone who has ever contemplated the price of principle, the nature of resolve, or the fragile line between chaos and order. The monument on the hill is not just a marker of a past event, it is a question posed in stone. It asks every generation, what is worth defending? What cost are we willing to bear? And what, in the end, do we hope to build from the sacrifice? The Battle of Bunker Hill offers no easy answers, only the stark, enduring example of a day when ordinary men on a nondescript hill grappled with those questions in the most immediate way possible, and in doing so, altered the course of history. Their story is a permanent part of our landscape, our memory, and our understanding of what it means to be a nation born from an act of defiant, costly will.